We talk a lot about the drivers, but it isn't all about the driver. Technical design may be the biggest part of the sport. Innovations come and go, but some are here to stay, and some we would rather see go away. But one thing is certain, innovations and technical design are a huge part of the equation, and many feared that Formula One's new technical regulations for 2022 would mean the end of design diversity and a Grand Prix grid consisting of identical cars. But nothing could be more wrong, as we've seen a wide range of different cars in the last 18 months. Thus, despite some obviously more rigid restrictions, each machine had different characteristics, with the side pods enabling a broad range of design choices. And it's safe to say that we're seeing a trend evolving now. After a year and a half of this regulatory regime, we've begun to witness a wholesale movement towards one of these concepts, the downwash solution, as teams see it best meets the overall aerodynamic demands of the current rules. Let's dive into some of the most innovative design aspects we've seen in the last years. Alpine, AlphaTauri and Red Bull were the first to adopt this type of technology, while Alpine was the first to pursue its own distinct development route, with the team adjusting their intake design as early as the 2022 Azerbaijan Grand Prix in preparation. The waterslide, gully, or whatever terminology is used to describe it, takes advantage of the fact that the majority of the side pod bodywork used under these new regulations is a facade, allowing designers to shrink wrap the bodywork to the components more tightly than they could under previous regulations. Alpine discovered that because the front section of the side pod satisfied its aerodynamic objectives, it could make greater use of the top bodywork of the side pod to guide the airflow into the correct spots downstream. While it may obviously claim credit for this new branch of research, it is also possible that it was inspired by Ferrari's bathtub-like approach it debuted early 2022. The side pod bodywork used by Ferrari, like the downwash ramp solution, is broader than what is required to wrap the internal components, with most of that bodywork involved in reconditioning the turbulent airflow generated upstream of it. The scalloped upper surfaces of the bathtub functioned in conjunction with a set of cooling gills that the regulations permitted, resulting in the rear cooling outlets being decreased in size. During 2022, Ferrari did make some alterations to the layout, but these were topographic optimizations rather than a broad conceptual shift. Aston Martin and Williams were the first to break rank in 2022, switching from their respective high-waisted and short-ramp solutions to those more closely aligned with the downwash trio's ideology. The primary move occurred for Aston Martin during the Spanish Grand Prix, when it made a determined attempt to emulate the RB18's floor and side pod solution, albeit hampered by the side pod's intake design, with the upper SIP impeding a transition to the open top option advocated by Red Bull. Meanwhile, Williams was one of the first teams to establish its own design identity before the season began, with the Grove team taking an innovative approach that incorporated a bypass duct on the top shoulder of the side pod. The system was constructed in such a manner that while the duct was open, it helped feed airflow down its reduced slope to the floor below, but it could also be closed off, improving cooling capacity. Williams plainly recognized early on that its plan was not going to deliver the performance it desired, but it couldn't build its own version of the longer downwash ramp until Silverstone. Suitable alterations were subsequently made to its floor and engine cover so that they all contributed to an increase in performance. Mercedes was the other significant outlier in terms of side pod design, with the team first presenting a more conventional layout during its 2022 launch, which it later utilized at a shakedown in Barcelona. The teams then traveled to Bahrain for the formal pre-season test, when Mercedes introduced their innovative solution, quickly named the Zero Pod, which went into the books as one of the worst innovations. And not only that, but it also created more problems for Mercedes than it improved them. The Zero Pod stood in sharp contrast to many of its competitors' methods, with only a slim vertical outlet protruding out of the side of the W13 chassis, which was responsible for cooling its internals. The remaining bodywork clung closely to the components stored within, much as all teams had proceeded to shrink-wrap their bodywork under the cover of the previous regulation regime. The team had to think a bit laterally when it came to the upper SIS, which was housed in its own fairing both ahead and above the main bodywork to meet its Zero Pod targets. The aftermath of the Zero Pod is still felt by the Mercedes drivers, who are still regularly bouncing across the track. McLaren, like many of its competitors, began the season with its original concept, but quickly shifted to something closer to the Alpine, AlphaTauri and Red Bull solutions. It was able to incorporate more of the DNA of the latter crew in its design since it used a comparable intake configuration. This underbite solution for the inlet was fully incorporated into McLaren's aesthetic for 2022, with the team conducting a full makeover of the sidepods, floor and engine cover at the Austrian Grand Prix, laying the groundwork for the team's significant rise in the competitive order. The car's redesign has left no surface untouched, with the underbite and intake, undercut, flank geometry, and length of the sidepod's downwash ramp all being enhanced. McLaren has also included a considerably deeper waterslide on the upper surface of the MCL60 sidepods, following in the footsteps of Aston Martin. The deeper waterslide solution is an excellent illustration of how F1 teams can take a concept and then shift the needle by implementing it. The AMR23's design, for example, is based on a shallower version originally seen on the Alpine A522 in 2022, which has since sparked various new development ideas, including one from Aston Martin, which has already taken its design a step further with an upgrade launched in Canada. Meanwhile, Ferrari has now included its own version of the waterslide element, although a shallower form, after taking the initial steps towards a more downwash ramp option when it changed its sidepods at the Spanish Grand Prix. The revisions also forced the team to redesign its cooling gill system, with much of the duty for that now resting on the shoulder of the engine cover, though it still has the flexibility to enhance or reduce cooling via replaceable panels contained inside the bodywork. As part of the update, it kept its S-duct arrangement with a solution baked into the overall philosophy of its sidepod, given that the vertical inlet beside the chassis is used to transport airflow from beneath the main inlet and deliver it out over the upper surface of the sidepod via the curved outlet beside the halo. Mercedes' refusal to recognize that the zero-pod idea was defective and continue with it in 2023 forced the team to adopt an even more Frankenstein sidepod strategy when it ultimately made the transition at the Monaco Grand Prix. This is owing to the position of the SIS fairing, which cannot be modified without introducing a new chassis. This also jeopardizes the design of the intake, undercut, and upper bodywork of the sidepod based on other alternatives. At the Belgian Grand Prix, the team refined the intake, the remainder of the sidepod bodywork, and the floor. Thus, the Monaco modification was likewise an intermediate solution. And while it is clearly capable of extracting greater performance from its own design, it'll almost certainly take a totally different approach to this part of the car next season. Red Bull is presently at the tip of the spear, therefore it's no surprise that the downwash ramp idea is frequently ascribed to it, even though others began their 2022 campaign with comparable concepts. While the pursuing group has experimented with waterslide-style solutions, Red Bull has remained calm thus far, sticking to a more innocuous ramp in its bodywork down to the back of their floor. Where it hasn't held back is in its choice to enhance the forward area of the sidepod, with a focus on the RB19's inlet and how it may impact the extent of the undercut. This voyage began in Azerbaijan, when the inlet's height was lowered, but it was extended to compensate. This was followed by a more major improvement at the Hungarian Grand Prix, in which the team changed the internal components and ducting of the sidepod, while improving the exterior bodywork for additional aerodynamic advantages. The inlet and underbite scoop were updated, with the latter being expanded forward, making the intake appear even smaller from certain angles. This also enlarges the undercut while sheltering the entrance from the wayward and turbulent wake created by the car's front end. It'll be interesting to see if they'll be able to further develop their sidepods for their 2024 Challenger. But it's evident that the teams are now on a single development path, but it doesn't mean they're all doing the same thing. It's actually quite the opposite, and it will be interesting to see which of these competing solutions teams adopt in the future, as well as whether there are any further offshoots from the main development tree. So what's your take on the design trends we're seeing right now? Do you like what you're seeing? Or do you think the involvement of all the intricate designs and nuances make a car more important than its driver? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. We're interested to read your take on the current design trends and the importance of a good car. And one more question. If everyone was driving the same car, what would your top 5 look like? Let us know and we'll leave our thoughts on your opinion.